Welcome to this session. We'll be exploring the issue of cost transparency, and in particular, the cost transparency initiative that the PLSA Investment Association and the LGPS Scheme Advisory Board are key founders for. I'm delighted to be joined by Victoria Bell from RPMI, who's got a scheme with a long history of looking at cost transparency issues, and Mel Duffield, Chair of the CTI Board and also Exec at USS. This is a live stream session as well, so welcome to our millions of online watchers. We're also going to be doing some polling in this session and very shortly, so if you want to take out your smartphone and get your fingers ready, please do. We're looking forward to your questions during the session through the app, through the online app, and also the old-fashioned way of putting your hand up, and we can pick you out quite easily. So if you're all ready, we'll start with those questions, and you'll have a few moments to complete them. Okay, look at this. A highly informed audience. Oh, some doubt creeping in. Some more doubt. Okay, right. I think this should gives us some space for growth and development, as they say. Okay. Question number 2 coming your way now. He is here tomorrow, so those of you... Oh, look at this. We should have added an all button to this category, I see now, but the benefit of hindsight. Okay. I think a pretty decent degree of familiarity, I think, which probably aligns with the answers to the first question. So thank you all very much. We'll probably be coming back to you later just to double check whether you still believe your decisions were right just this moment ago. But I'll hand over to Mel to start us up.
Thanks, Joe. I'm not sure Alistair Darling will be accepting an invitation to lunch anytime soon based on that. So, Cost Transparency Initiative. I'm Mel Duffield. I was asked to chair the Cost Transparency Initiative back in November last year, very much picking up the mantle from Chris Sear, who'd spearheaded the work of the Institutional Disclosure Working Group. And the stage we're at now is very much about the practical stage of testing these templates and then launching and then supporting the rollout and the education and guidance around that. And that's really about what it says on the slide, so promoting that understanding, raising awareness and encouraging full transparency and standardisation of costs and charges, particularly with asset owners in mind. This is very much a collaborative initiative, so the PLSA is providing the secretariat to the Cost Transparency Initiative. The Investment Association is one of the other founding members, and their role is really important, obviously in terms of working with the asset managers, and we'll come on to some of the specific inputs they're providing later, but also the local government scheme advisory board. So the LGPS is actually quite ahead of the curve on this. They've been working on this since 2017, and there's some real success stories in that area that we'll touch on later in the presentation. So the story so far, obviously the issue of charges disclosure has been a political hot topic for quite some time. It's had a lot of scrutiny from high-profile politicians, shadow ministers, and the Work and Pension Select Committee. And most recently, Frank Field has been carrying out his own inquiry into the issue. This started, in terms of the recent history, with that LGPS Code of Transparency and the transparency reporting template that they published at the time. There was then the FCA's Asset Management Market Study that was published in the summer of 2017. And they particularly put forward a number of recommendations and remedies. And one of those remedies was to set up the Institutional Disclosure Working Group to work on those templates. But they particularly were concerned with what they saw as failures on the buy and supply side, but particularly on the buy side in terms of asset owners being able to obtain the cost information that they wanted consistently and indeed feeling empowered to know what to ask for. So on the back of that, the Institutional Disclosure Working Group was set up. This was a group of experts that were working on those templates, and they submitted their report to the FCA back in the summer of last year, and then that was published in November, on the back of which the Cost Transparency Initiative was launched, and our focus has been very much about taking those templates that the IDWG submitted to the FCA and really kicking the tyres of them to make sure that they're ready and fit for purpose for launch. So the regulatory context here is important. The FCA is watching this area very closely, quite literally because they actually sit as one of the observers on the Cost Transparency Initiative board. And what they've said is that they think the CTI has got the right skills and experience to take this forward, but if they don't see the kind of traction, they don't see the kind of take-up they're expecting to within a reasonable period, then they will look and think about mandatory measures in this space. The CMA obviously put their market investigation out recently as well, and particularly around investment consultants and fiduciary management, and they flagged the Cost Transparency Initiative as being very much in the right direction of travel and aligned with their recommendations. TPR and DWP, they also have observer status on the Cost Transparency Board, and they're in particular looking at how do they encourage trustees to be more proactive in this space. And one of the things that they're considering is whether they should publish guidance that actually requires trustees to request this information, and then through the usual routes of chairs' statements and the like, how do they then disclose some of that information to members. And finally, we're trying to make sure that this is consistent with the cost reporting already out there in terms of MiFID II, and that the templates are designed to be compatible as far as possible with that. So the templates, there is what we call a tree of templates. So for some specific asset classes, private equity and physical assets, they have their own templates. And those are two that are particularly being tested currently through the technical groups. I'm sure Victoria will come on to talk about some of the practicalities of that. Also the ancillary services template, which is much more about the custodian side of things. That then feeds up into the main account template that includes the listed equities, debt instruments, derivatives, and so on. And that is the template that looks very consistent with the LGPS's current reporting template. And then finally, there's a user template, and this will allow asset owners to see a snapshot of those figures so they can do easy comparisons across different asset managers and across different product types. The Investment Association's role here is to make that as user-friendly as possible and provide machine-readable templates. And in the last few weeks, the Investment Association has given us assurances that they will have those machine-readable templates ready at the same time as the templates are launched in the spring. And that should help to make this much more engaging in terms of the information that can be fed out of those templates and used to support discussions around governance. The user template, so this is what the summary template looks like, and it allows you to unpick the gross returns from the net return, but see some of the more granular lines underneath that in terms of where the costs are coming from. And that is the kind of key piece of information that will be seen. And what do we want to achieve with that? Clearly, we want to establish better cost understanding amongst trustees and asset owners and empower them in terms of the questions that they're asking asset managers, so we get consistency there and they feel they've got the confidence to ask those questions. Ultimately, that's going to drive better outcomes for members, and I think until we've actually cracked this nut, there'll still be that political scrutiny. There will still be a sense that if there are stones left unturned, there may be hidden costs here, and that's what we're really trying to achieve in terms of driving up that trust. So we need to focus on take-up here. So once the templates are launched, we'll be very much focused around that education guidance piece and tracking that over the course of the year. Do we think this will work? What impact will it have? Well, there is a big success story here in terms of what's been achieved with the LGPS so far. They have a kite mark. So for providers that are working with the templates, they can get that kite mark for the Code of Transparency. They've already had 100 asset managers sign up to this in a relatively short space of time. And in terms of the assets, those providers are managing 180 billion of the LGPS assets. So that's really seen remarkable take-up. That is, of course, linked to the fact that this has become a mandatory part of the local government pension funds' asset management processes and through their RFP processes as well. But the LGPS have said they'll adopt the cost transparency templates as soon as they're ready, so we will see that immediate take-up through the LGPS funds. Next steps, so the CTI board met for the first time in January. We have been listening to the results of the pilot this morning. So this morning we had the second Cost Transparency Initiative board, and that feedback that's coming back is very positive. It's suggesting that the templates themselves are fit for purpose. We've got some specific issues to look at in terms of some specific alternative asset classes, but it's very much around the supporting guidance that goes out with those templates to make them as user-friendly as possible. So we're tracking to launch these in the spring. That isn't a civil service spring, that's very much back end of April. Apologies, David. Back end of April, early mid-May, and we expect to make a formal announcement on that in the next few weeks so that we can manage expectations in terms of when these will go live. And then we're agreeing at the board what that means in terms of review periods, because obviously we'll need to be able to explain what take-up we're seeing. We'll need to think about the metrics and measures for that. But we'll be very much focusing on that engagement piece. And the aim is that this is adopted within the 2019-20 year. We'll align it in terms of reporting periods, but we'd expect either that December reporting period or March for asset owners and asset managers to be working with these templates. Where can you go for further information? Well, Alicia and Sam down the front work with Joe. They're the PLSA team here, and they've got a website set up. There'll be more information in the coming weeks in terms of a press release here, and of course the templates due very shortly as well. So any queries, you can speak to the PLSA team or of course speak to me. And I'll now hand over to Victoria, who's going to talk about the templates in practice.
Thank you, Mel.
Thank you. Right, thanks, Mel. So my name's Victoria Bell. I'm the Director for Trustee Accounting at RPMI Railpen. For those of you that don't know, we manage the Railways Pension Scheme, which is a scheme with about 350,000 members, close to £30 billion worth of assets. And we've been on a journey into cost transparency over the last few years, which I'm going to talk to you about. And also we've been involved in the pilot study that Mel mentioned. And I'll tell you about early indications and what it was like to be involved in that pilot study. So first of all, our journey into cost transparency. We started our investment transformation programme back in 2013, and it was a full roots to branches review of our investment process. So we looked at the investment beliefs, we looked at culture, we looked at governance, we looked at our processes, we looked at our systems, all the way through the process of our investments. And we focused on the value chain, looking at our cost awareness. I mentioned cost awareness and not cost reduction because it wasn't about cost reduction, it was about cost awareness. The overall aim was to improve value for a given level of risk. With alpha getting harder to find, we needed to look at different ways to add value for our members, and looking at costs and a focus on cost was one way that we could do that. So what do I mean by cost awareness? Not a confession. Those are the words of the late, great George Best, for those of you that don't know. Now, he was obviously somebody who was very, very cost aware. He knew what he was spending his money on. He knew the bits that were adding value, the booze, the birds, and the fast car, and he knew the bits that he was squandering. For us, as the trustee, did we know what expenditure we were spending? Did we know we were getting value out of every single pound of our members' money that we were spending? Were we getting value, or were we just squandering? Now, we all know what gets measured can be managed. So the first step we needed to do was measure those costs. We needed to improve our cost discovery. We needed to improve our cost measurement and our monitoring of those costs. Once we got that, we could start to monitor them and manage them. In order to do that, we needed to increase transparency. Now, we were doing this back in 2013. Templates weren't around, so we had to do this ourselves. So we wrote to our managers, we got all of the year-end accounts, we invested in approximately 300 funds and funds of funds, and we sat in a corner in a dark room and we went through all of these sets of financial statements and annual accounts and pulled out all of the expenses. It was a really arduous task to get that transparency on those costs. But what did we find? So if you look in the RPS accounts for 2011, you'll see costs of £76.5 million. So we've got these costs, we're monitoring them, we're measuring them, we're managing them, we're on it. When we'd finished our work in the dark room, we actually uncovered another £213 million worth of costs. I mean, it's phenomenal. So we're busy focusing on this £76.5 million worth of costs and managing those costs. And over here, we've got £200 million that we didn't even know we had. Don't get me wrong, obviously we knew when we were investing in funds, we knew we were paying management fees, we knew we were paying performance fees, we knew the managers could take out legal fees, other expenses, other admin costs. But we did not know what the pound note value of that was across all of our funds. We had to sit, go through those financial statements, add up all the costs, pull them all out to get the total figure. I was certainly surprised by that it was that quantum. Now, we made a bold claim at the time that we were going to reduce our costs by £100 million. So what did we do when we knew we had costs of £290 million and we'd picked ourselves up off the floor? First thing we did was we evaluated our use of funds across private markets, across hedge funds, other asset classes. Were we paying unnecessary layers of management fees? We looked at our segregated mandates, our equity managers and our fixed income managers. We renegotiated those fees, made some savings there. We also insourced a lot of our investment management activities where we had the in-house skill, processes and systems to be able to do that. So things like property is the latest asset class we've insourced. Emerging market debt, we'll leave that to the experts. We're not expert at that yet. So what was the result of all of that work that we've been doing since 2013? So there's the 290 million that we started in 2011. 1.69% was our TER. That's a complete TER, so it's got performance costs in, transaction costs in, property expenses, everything. Total costs, they're the costs that the members suffer in. And that's what it was in 2011. Roll forward a few years. 2018 still draft numbers, but at the minute, we're looking like 85 basis points. So that's an 84 basis points save per annum for our members, which is a great, great result, and we've still got plans to reduce that yet further. A lot of numbers on that slide, so just looking at it graphically. The black line shows the TER reducing from that 1.69 down to that 85 basis points. And you can see the costs split year on year between the indirect costs, so those hidden costs, and the blue, which is our direct costs, so they're our custody costs, fund manager fees for segregated mandates that were being invoiced, internal costs, staff costs, etc. So you can see we've made some savings on our direct costs, but you can see the bulk of the savings have come from those indirect costs, those hidden fees. And without doing that exercise to understand what those costs were, to get transparency over those, we never would have been able to reduce those costs. So some of you might be a bit cynical and go, oh yeah, if you want to reduce your costs, all you need to do is buy a tracker fund, buy some bonds, put it under your mattress, that'll reduce your costs. But you can see from the pie chart that actually our asset allocation hasn't moved much. So the segment from 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock, the dark green colour, they're our alternatives. The bit between 8 and 9 o'clock, the light green, that's our property. So they're the costly assets. And actually, we haven't really changed our asset allocation all that much, but yet we've managed to reduce the costs. So as a result of the work that we've done on cost transparency over the years, we were asked to be involved in the Cost Transparency Initiative, which we were really pleased to do. So I just wanted to share with you some of our thoughts and some of the questions we had going into the pilot study and what we found as being part of the pilot study. So my first question is it going to work for all assets? Is this just going to be for bonds and equities, or is it actually going to work for some of the more different asset classes that we hold? As Mel explained, there's different templates to pick up those different assets. So yes, it did work. We had a few issues with our royalties funds. We also have a ground rent fund. They were a little bit tricky. They didn't quite fit into the template, but generally, all of our alternatives, all of our asset classes worked, which was great news. There's other templates out there. We have a lot of US managers, for instance, private markets, and they use an ILPA template, and they send us their results on that template. It's broadly similar. So actually, we've got the information on. We used that. That was fine. One of my questions, were the investment managers willing to give us this information? It's all very well as asking. It's not legislative yet. Are they going to give us that information? We had a few pushed back that said, no, the information's in the capital statement, it's in the year-end accounts, we're not filling this form in for you. When we went back and explained why, explained what we were doing, we explained that other managers were doing it, we explained how difficult it was to extract the cost information from the year-end accounts, they all eventually obliged. Are the investment managers able to give us this information? Not quite yet, in some cases. And there was two groups of investment managers that couldn't give us that information. One were, yes, we can do it, but just not yet. We're working on our systems, and we'll have it in place for back end of March, April. So some of the larger fund managers fell into that category. They wanted to get the systems in place to do it automatically. Some of our other managers, mostly private equity, weren't able to yet because they didn't have the results. So we were a December year end. We were asking for this information in early February. It just wasn't available at that time. But again, it was something that they would be able to do in time. Transaction costs was one where we saw a bit of inconsistency from fund managers to fund managers. Some of them capitalised costs, so they excluded it from the template. Others don't. Similarly for startup funds, startup costs of some of the funds in the venture capital funds, they'd expensed all their costs in year one, so they said, we've got no transaction costs. So that's going to make a very lumpy reporting of their costs. That's something to iron out. And most importantly is the template user-friendly, which I think Mel touched on as well. And my very honest answer is not quite yet, but very nearly. And that's the whole point of doing the pilot study. So some of our managers were putting numbers in percentage columns and percentages in numbers columns. They didn't understand where to put the costs. We needed a bit of work, a bit of explanation in how to use the templates. But that's exactly why we're doing this pilot study, so that when it's released to everybody en masse, we've ironed out all of those bugs and it is user-friendly. So I've no doubt it will be when it's released in the spring. So overall, I mean, the fact that we had a lot of questions from our investment managers, why do I need to fill this in? How do I fill this in? What about these costs? Just shows to me how much this is actually needed. It wasn't something that the fund managers understood or got their heads around straight away. So that just shows how much it was needed. The managers were asking us a lot of information about their costs and where do I put these costs and what type of cost is this? So we really need the managers to understand their costs before they can report it to us. The template will absolutely drive consistency and comparability. It'll make it very easy for trustees and investors to understand the full cost of their investments and get that full transparency. They won't need to hire people to sit in dark rooms with reams and reams of financial statements to pull the costs out. And once we're armed with that information on the true cost of investing, trustees, they're just better informed and they can make better decisions for their members, which is absolutely what cost transparency is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Mel, we've had a lot of questions come through on the app, and I'm sure there'll be those in the audience who will have questions and kind of raise their hands in the slightly more old-fashioned way. I'm going to start with kind of sort of chair's prerogative, and maybe kind of picks up one of the themes of one of the questions as well. So why is it that sort of the time for cost transparency has come now when perhaps previously there have been attempts and it hasn't really taken off? Mel, do you want to start?
So I think we're kind of peeling off the layers of the onion, aren't we? So you've had the kind of MiFID II disclosure, but I think the appetite is there to get this more comprehensive across a range of asset classes, and as Victoria said in her presentation, to get that consistency and to empower trustees to feel like they know what the questions are. They're asking the same questions, the asset managers are being asked the same questions, so everyone is working within the same framework, and it feels like that is now coming to a head.
I think there's also the way the markets have been. You know, we're not getting double-digit returns anymore, so trustees have got to look harder to generate that income. If you're making 12, 13% on your portfolio, paying an extra few basis points on costs just doesn't really matter. But when returns are squeezed, actually every basis point does matter and does impact on members. So you really need to understand the costs. You need that transparency to be able to fully understand what you're paying, so you can drive those costs down if that's the right decision to take.
Open to the floor. Question here.
I think I can do it. It was just a very small question to you, Victoria. When you spoke about the user-friendliness of the templates, you said not quite. And by user, did you mean the investment managers filling in the templates as opposed to the trustees reading them and using them for their decision-making?
A bit of both. I think for us, as a user sending it out to the fund managers, we needed a bit of talking through exactly how to use it, and the fund managers were then on the phone to us, asking us to explain how to do it. So it was a little bit of both. Yeah.
Okay. Gentleman here.
One cost that I'm spending most time wrestling with is property development costs. The fund manager spends money on property. What's the direction of travel for that? Would that have to be disclosed in the same way as transaction costs?
One for you.
So the property template has had a lot of testing to make sure that it is robust. It was one of the kind of less tested templates through the IDWG, but yeah, that now is in a state where it is considered fit for purpose.
Gentleman in the middle.
I actually was on some of the early work with this, but I've lost touch with it a little bit. But one question I always had was, for me as a member of the stakeholder pension scheme, how, when and how might this work for me?
Do you want me to pick that up?
Yeah, you pick that up.
So the kind of stakeholder element is a further iteration down the road. So the templates as developed are primarily for institutions. There is a potential longer term objective of making it available to stakeholders, but we're not at that stage yet. There are of course other things that maybe help with stakeholder costs and to some extent, but
I think it's a group stakeholder it's included. Isn't it?
yeah. Just individual stakeholder, I think, is the question. Lady here.
Can I ask, have you had any success in making these costs contractual as opposed to the managers just telling you about what they are? And my experience in pouring through a lot of investment management agreements is that these costs are all discretionary, and it is so difficult to find out what they are and which layers they come into. And is the next step making these more nailed down than just as disclosed sum?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, absolutely. It's not contractual. I think we're lucky in that we're a relatively large pension scheme. We have good engagement for our investment managers, so we're able to use our size to get that information out of the investment managers. But yeah, a push to make it contractual would make it easier for everybody.
I guess one of the elements there, Mel, is the templates are voluntary, but the all-seeing eye of the FCA and the slightly smaller eye of DWP are staring down as well. I mean, how do you think this will work out?
In terms of
the take-up, I guess, and what the levers might be.
So, I mean, we obviously will have a regular dialogue with the regulators, and I think they'll expect to see those metrics on take-up, and we're going to try and track those through the course of the next year. But yeah, I think they will be asking for clear messages from us to the degree to which asset managers are responding to this and complying with it.
Yeah, I think just to pick up from a point of view, the kind of founders of the CTR as well, which include the PLSA, the Investment Association, and the Scheme Advisory Board of the LGPS, all of those parties are committed to making it a success. So with all parts of the system on board, it should help, and there's definitely a commitment from both the buyer and provider side to deliver a broad market take-up. So, question here.
It's just asking really from a manager perspective, is we're wrestling with a variety of different cost disclosures, but the one that's probably exercised us the most is transaction costs, and I'm curious to how you actually use that information, because to our mind it's very different in nature to fees. We've no as a fund manager, you've every incentive to minimise that, no incentive to inflate it. It's a cost of managing the strategy. So when you get that information, what do you do? What do you actually do with it, or how would you manage it?
Mm-hmm. I think at the moment the transaction costs are the area that we don't have the information on, if I'm perfectly honest. We have transaction cost information on our properties because we don't buy and sell those very often. It's very easy to see what the transaction costs are. But some of our other asset classes, it's very difficult to get the transaction costs on there. As a long-term investor, we wouldn't expect a high volume of transactions. So I guess it's using it as a monitoring. I agree that there's nothing you can really do to manage those costs down, but it's about awareness.
I'll pick up a few of the questions we've had on the app. I think one of the themes that we've talked about quite a lot actually around this issue, and certainly we've talked about around the CTI board. How do you grapple with the issue of cost versus value for money or performance? I guess your lived experience, Victoria, and Mel, from a wider perspective.
Yeah, I mean, like I said in the presentation, it's about cost. It's cost awareness and it's adding value. It's not about cost reduction. So whenever we present to the trustees any information about costs, it's always alongside the performance. So they're always taken alongside. So we're not looking at costs in isolation. I didn't have the stats, but reducing those costs has not impacted on our performance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And have you changed strategy as an approach or governance structures?
We've changed our governance structure. We've changed a lot of the compliance around the investment process, and we have changed the governance, and but we haven't changed fundamentally our asset allocation. We haven't changed what we're investing in, and we haven't changed the performance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Mel, what would you hope the information kind of leads to?
I guess the challenge for us, isn't it, is to provide those case studies of the impact that it's had. So I was speaking to a CIO earlier who was talking about, perhaps some trustees might be sceptical that as long as you understand your net return, that's sufficient. But he was saying actually for them it's understanding of those additional costs, what share of the return is going back to the trustee and ultimately the member versus the asset manager. And actually when they saw that information, that allowed them to have those more challenging discussions. Yep. We've obviously seen evidence, anecdotes from the LGPS work that they are finding cost savings through those routes. And I think if you look at the evidence from the Dutch pensions industry as well, you have seen that driving down cost.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Let me just check, Mel, in terms of timelines, you said spring in terms of release, but what would you expect people to be doing on either side of the kind of fence after spring?
So we've been discussing the timeline at the board. It was a hot topic this morning. So we're expect to release those templates late April, early May, and we'd expect then that asset owners would be asking their providers to start populating those templates. Particularly, we want to work with the consultants as well to make sure they're familiar with the templates, and then we'd be looking within a reasonable time frame, as I said, sort of the 2019-20 reporting year, for those templates to start being used. And I think if by the end of that year, the review timeline we're looking at is kind of April 2020, we're not seeing that take up, then that's the point I think we need to start having those difficult conversations with the FCA.
Okay. Thank you. Any further questions from the floor before I pick up some of the additional questions from the online questions? Gentleman again.
It was just a quick observation that you're saying the performance was unchanged. The performance figures that you see are usually net of the charges. So although you've managed to halve your charges, it's just to make the observation that although the trustee might be presented with the performance and then the charges, the performance is usually net of that.
That's true, yeah.
But I wasn't particularly clear in my first question. My concern about property development costs being bundled in with other costs is it is a little bit unique. So the fund manager might be doing a value-add activity to enhance the value of that asset, but you're going to disclose that similar to, say, fees to a lawyer. So that was my challenge to leave with you, take or leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the property development costs we see very much, because we're about 10% in property, and we see them very much in the same bucket as transaction costs and to a certain extent performance costs. They're not necessarily bad costs. So when we're reporting, we report the costs before performance, transaction and property costs, and then after, so that you've got an understanding of what the total costs are, but the costs that you're really focusing on managing are before those costs, such as property development costs.
A couple of fairly practical questions that come through on the templates themselves. Mel, I mean, are they consistent with other disclosures? Will they replace DCPT? How do they fit with MiFID too?
Yeah. So the assurances that the team working on them have given me is that these will be flexible enough that they can accommodate those current existing approaches, so they will be compatible. And so what is absolutely key there is the supporting guidance that sits with the templates that explains how those pieces align, but it's not intended to be a replacement, it's intended to be more comprehensive.
I can agree that is the case. Okay. We've got a couple more questions about, what might some of the drivers be afterwards, and I think kind of related to some of these kind of performance questions. Do you think there's a risk that people see costs like you did, are very unexpected, and then the reaction is dramatic? Maybe that even moves people to think about shifting from active to passive. And how do you kind of manage that? I guess you said you drew breath when you saw the cost in the first place. What happened next?
That's a very difficult one. I think it depends on the trustees, I guess, of that pension scheme. Once you're armed with that information, you can use it to then make your decisions. It may be, yes, those costs are high, but do you know what? We're getting the performance returns. We're happy to pay those costs. Or actually, no, we're not happy to pay those costs. We're not happy with the share of the performance gains between us and the fund managers. We want to reduce those costs. And it might lead to a change in strategy. But I would imagine that most trustees and most pension schemes are sophisticated enough to understand that it is about the value and it's not about the cost. It's not about reducing the cost. It's about improving the value.
Okay. And I'm interested, you took the journey. I think one of the things that we talked a lot about at the sort of CTI board is sort of trustee education piece and the kind of consultancy piece, and how do people begin to understand, when costs are reported, what's there and what's next? And just interested in how any suggestions for how to help spread that across the whole market?
Mm-hmm. Well, our trustees, given that there's about 10 of them in the audience, are all excellent and very well informed and very well educated and understand everything that I present them about costs. But there does need to be an education on the costs and an understanding that costs aren't necessarily bad. Mm-hmm. And it does need to be spread right down to the user, especially when you're talking about costs in DC funds and rolling any costs that are involved in DC funds. The average member of a DC fund, there's a risk that they look at the high cost fund and they don't invest in it because the costs are high and they lose out on the return. So there really does need to be an education across the market.
Yeah, I think it's that context piece, isn't it? So it feels like, it sounds really naff, but we are at the start of this journey. If we get 12 months' time with the templates being completed, then you're going to start to get that more sort of sophisticated dialogue about how you actually compare apples and apples within these templates. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We're beginning to come to a close of this session, so I've just got a chance for any final questions from the floor before I maybe just pick up a final question to both our panellists. Okay, so interested from both of you. I guess from your scheme perspective, where are you headed next? Do you think there's a further stage beyond where you've gotten to? And Mel, in terms of timeline, what next for the CTI again, and your hopes and kind of aspirations, just to wrap up?
Okay.
For us, yeah, we're on this journey. We're continuing on this journey. Our TER is down around about the mid-80s at the minute. We want to reduce that yet further. That TER is inclusive of performance, transaction costs, all our property costs. That's an all-in cost. So we want to reduce that further. A lot of our high costs are coming from our legacy private equity funds that we invested in several years ago that we're locked into. So we'll see those costs reducing. We're bringing more and more asset classes in-house. So I just see a continuation of this journey.
So obviously the immediate milestone is the launch of the templates in the coming weeks and the guidance alongside it. I think where we want to focus really hard then is on the kind of early adoption around that, and then making sure that we've got some of these stories of where they've had a positive impact coming out in the industry, so that when we're sat here in 12 months' time, we're looking back and actually what we're seeing is the majority of trustees and asset managers thinking that completion of the templates is situation norm, and then we look forward to the next year and how we move on from there.
Okay. Thank you both. Now, audience, you got the chance to kind of answer a few polling questions earlier. You've heard a little bit more about the templates, the goals, the aspirations, and what it can do for a scheme. What are you gonna do next? Please vote away. That's looking like high demand now.
That's what we wanted.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you both very much. That's been very informative. I think you're around for the rest of the day, so if people want to ask any more questions of either of you about your experience or ask the team about the work that's going on, you may remember their mug shots are up earlier. Please find them or find me. I'd like to ask you to thank our panel in the usual way.